Okay, so my project was on the examination of Native Americans and whether or not they have been treated fairly, specifically addressing the US government. So, my main focus was to examine the historical and ongoing treatment of Native Americans that highlight systemic injustices and their lasting impacts on Indigenous communities. So there's many reasons why I chose this topic. One has to do with the personal connection because I am Native. I found this topic very intriguing, specifically because I'm very involved in my culture and I want to be able to spread the word about Native voices as much as I can. So the personal connection of understanding systemic treatment and marginalization, the importance of bringing Indigenous perspectives into mainstream conversations because I feel like a lot of the time issues are left out that involve Native conversations. And then it's relevant to public discourse because of ongoing discussions about historical injustices. And then there is the importance of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and their rights. So there's a lot of literature, but specifically A Very True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. That one's a really good one because it tells the story of his actual life. It's basically an autobiography. And then Burn My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown. That's another really, really good book. But one of my ones that I'm looking forward to reading is The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King as well. So all these are really, really good books that address Native issues in Native life. My thesis statement throughout my essay was the historical and ongoing treatment of Native Americans by the U.S. government reflects systemic injustices that continue to disadvantage Indigenous communities socially, economically, and culturally. Throughout my essay, I made sure to hit on social, economic, and cultural issues that are results of the U.S. government's treatment towards Natives. So, to start, my first argument and a little bit of background to set up the essay is the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that was set under President Andrew Jackson. It was a law enacted to remove Native tribes from their ancestral lands in southeastern U.S. It was aimed to make land available to European American settlers to set up fronts for protective reasons, and in reality, that resulted in the Trail of Tears. So 16,000 natives were forced to march west, and over 4,000 died from starvation, disease, and exposure. The Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes were all affected. So it has a really big impact on culture because there's a loss of sacred sites, disrupted spiritual and cultural practices, and then it impacts on Native identity as well, individually and as a community. Because of the forced displacement, it weakened community structures and traditions. And how I implemented this, one of the lines from my essay was that lands were not just geography, they were tied to cultural and spiritual identity of Indigenous peoples. And we see how influential the Indian Removal Act, and in this form, it's the U.S. government because it was President Andrew Jackson, how this sets up for everything that comes along because it does set up the way that natives were treated from here on out. So forced assimilation boarding schools, this is point number two. The purpose of these schools was to civilize Native children by easing their languages, beliefs, and custom. The motto of these schools was kill the Indian, save the man, because they thought that they were doing something helpful, but in reality, there was severe physical, emotional, and psychological abuse. Forced labor and strict punishments were set in place for Natives that were caught practicing their language and traditions. And in reality, what was really sad about these schools is that they were built alongside a cemetery because of how harsh the conditions were. A lot of children passed away. So the psychological impact is the trauma from these boarding schools have been passed down through generations, creating generational trauma, a cultural impact of high rates of mental health issues, lots of substance abuse, and cultural identity loss. And it created a stigma that Native kids are only limited to the reservations. So a lot of the time, natives won't move outside the reservations because they think that that's all they're bound to. And a quote from my essay is that these schools sever ties between generations, leading to a loss of cultural knowledge and identity. So, because of the generational trauma, it made it really, really hard for stories to be passed down along because a lot of the times it was a mental uh, coping mechanism to forget them, or it's just really, really hard to talk about. So that part of your history and your ancestor stories, it's really, really hard to kind of remember those and grow from them. Um, so I believe argument number three is modern land rights, talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL. It says a little over 1,100-mile pipeline that runs in from North Dakota to Illinois. It's a planted route that interrupts the Standing Rock Sioux reservations, water supply, and sacred sites. It's built right through it. A lot of issues, specifically contaminating water issues by oil spills. That's one of the biggest concerns. And then also a lack of consultation because Native leaders are not consulted about what is about to happen to their land. And it violates treaty rights, especially because these Native leaders aren't able to act adequately because they are not told the information to save their lands. It impacts sovereignty because it reinforces historical patterns where Native lands are exploited for economic gain. We saw that in the Indian Removal Act, and then a continuous struggle for Indigenous communities in order to protect their land and their rights. A quote from my essay reads: "The DAPL conflict underscores a reoccurring theme. Economic interests overshadow Native voices and rights." So the U.S. government is really just all about trying to earn as much money as they can. We thrive off of capitalism, but at what cost? Because we are hurting the population of many people who are marginalized. My fourth argument is socioeconomic disparities. Native Americans' poverty rate is 25.4% in comparison to the national average of 11.4. A lot of the time, you'll see costs on reservations being significantly higher than it would be in urban areas or suburban areas. Um, there's a lot of healthcare challenges, specifically the Indian Health Service. They provide inconsistent care and they're specifically very underfunded. And that leads to native life expectancy being 5.5 years lower than the national average. So, with inadequate healthcare, natives are very susceptible to diabetes, but with healthcare not being that great, it's very hard for them to get the help and get the care that they need. There are many educational gaps with lower high school and college graduation rates. This also goes back to the lack of well funded schools and resources. And then it also leads back to my point saying that Native kids, after or if they do graduate, they think that they're binded to the reservation, so that's why they just stay there. This all is rooted from dispossession of land and resources and generational neglect and last investment in infrastructure and services. So, with the US government consistently taking land and not giving it back, they also don't do anything to give back to Native peoples from stealing their land. And a quote from my essay reads: "These disparities are not accidental; they are a result of centuries of systemic race or marginalization," which is absolutely true. Like I said about the U.S. government stealing land, not giving it back, and not having anything to show for it. Native communities are really, really hurting economically. So some of my counter arguments, my first one reads: "Some Native American groups have adapted successfully, showing resilience, while few have thrived economically or culturally. Many others are still facing significant challenges that are rooted in historical exploitation. So these systemic challenges involve poverty, lack of adequate access to healthcare, and then limited educational resources. And then these successful stories are not representing of all tribes, and it can obscure ongoing inequalities. Um, those who have thrived are so very few, and a lot of times there's still issues going on behind the scenes that not most people are aware of. A key point to remember is that resilience does not negate the need for systemic change. There's always a need for change. My second counter argument was support for Native cultural preservation exists in the form of museums, language programs, and heritage sites. These initiatives are helpful to preserve the culture, but they can't undo the deep trauma that is rooted through forced assimilation of boarding schools. Ongoing struggles involve like these cultural programs lack sufficient funding, so not everyone is able to access them, or they are not rooted in depth in of education to provide, a full, transparent um, understanding because of how insufficient the funding is, and that they don't fully address socioeconomic disparities of psychological impacts because of generational trauma. Something to remember is that true preservation requires systemic support and reparative action, not just symbolic efforts. So these symbolic efforts are a great way to understand the knowledge, but really there is needed support that revolves in the native peoples. My third one is some native tribes benefit financially from gaming and tax exemptions, improving economic conditions. Only minority benefit from gaming enterprises, which we're specifically talking about casinos, and tax exemptions do not offset broader economic marginalizations many Native communities face. There's many systemic barriers that overlook populations, and then high poverty rates and inadequate infrastructure. A key point to remember is that economic gains are not evenly distributed and do not address systemic inequality. Natives are having to support themselves and their tribes through casinos. Non-native representation, admiration for native culture in an attempt to keep tradition alive is cultural appreciation. That is my fourth counter argument. Cultural admiration can easily be crossed into appropriation where aspects of native culture are taken out of context and commercialized. Appropriating strips sacred practices of their meaning that reduce to stereotypes. Instead, true respect is understanding, educating, and honoring Native perspectives. A key point for this is respect for Native culture means elevating Indigenous voices and not commodifying traditions, and people westernizing Native practices, patterns, beadwork, clothing, whatever it is. Um, if you don't fully understand the purpose and the practice and what they're used for, it is appropriation. And I'm gonna leave off here with one of my favorite quotes. It will be known forever by the tracks we leave. It's from the Dakota tribe. Um, Knowing that natives have had an extremely hard life and we're still here, we're still persevering, we're still growing, and we're creating new ways for our tribes to be known and seen is really important, and our tracks will always be left behind. And yeah.